Hello, everyone. Live from Vienna, Austria, it's Saturday morning. And for some of you, it is the great feast of Saints Peter and Paul. So if you're a new calendar, I say happy feast to you and end of the Apostles' Fast. Hronia Pola. Now we have a very exciting show for you today, a very prominent and renowned guest. It is Professor and Father Andrew Louth. I will tell you about him before we go on to the interview. Before I do so, my friends, let me tell you that here on YouTube, we now have available for you the videos on Divine Liturgy from our Divine Liturgy course. We are going to be putting them up here on YouTube at the Coffee with Sister Vassa YouTube channel, 2 by 2 every week. On Mondays, we will be posting those videos that are part of a still ongoing course available only to subscribers with 40 plus videos in this course, going through the Divine Liturgy step by step, every little unit of it, its history, its theological meaning, and so forth. We're doing that on Patreon, and that has been, thank you to the support of the subscribers, has been going on for quite some time now, but we want to make it available to everybody. So watch for those videos. Go to Divine Liturgy course here on YouTube, on the Coffee with Sister Vassa YouTube channel, as I said, and check out those videos and learn something new this summer. But as I said, you'll only see 2 videos per week. Okay, now that we got that out of the way, I want to tell you about our very renowned guest, and it's a great honor to have him on our show. Professor and Father Andrew Louth is a priest of the Russian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate. He is in the Suroj Diocese in the United Kingdom, and he serves a parish in Durham, England. To tell you about his academic background, in case you don't know, he, who is an author of many important books, I'll tell you about his books in a second, he studied at the universities of Cambridge and Edinburgh. First, he studied mathematics and then switched to theology and wrote his thesis on Karl Barth. Now, Father Andrew was born and raised an Anglican and was also an Anglican priest before becoming Orthodox at the age of 45. But in our interview with him, he himself will tell us about why he decided to join the Orthodox Church and also become a priest there. Now, he taught at Oxford University. He taught patristics there, and he taught Byzantine and early medieval history in Goldsmiths College at the University of London. And then finally, he went on to the University of Durham, where he soon became professor of patristic and Byzantine studies at the Department of Theology and Religion. I should mention that Father Andrew is a fellow of the British Academy. Now, if you don't know what that means, I will tell you that it is the pantheon of international scholarship. To become a fellow of the British Academy, you have to be a very accomplished scholar, as is Father Andrew. Now, his main research interests are, of course, patristic theology. He also taught on the impact of Islam on Greek Christianity in the Mediterranean region. And another research interest of his is from his most recent book, that is the research interest being modern Orthodox theology. Also, particularly, I would say, Russian Orthodox theology, also Romanian theology. Very interestingly, in his most recent book, let me get to that, it's called Modern Orthodox Thinkers, From the Philokalia to the Present. And in this book, he introduces us to 20 key thinkers from the last 2 centuries. What's very interesting, my friends, is that he includes certain women in his review of modern Orthodox thinkers. For example, the Holy Martyr and Mother Maria Skoptsova of Paris, And another example, he includes Elizabeth Ber Sigel of blessed memory. And that I find very interesting. And we will talk a little bit to him about how he views women's ministry in our today. Father Andrew has also written extensively on spirituality and mysticism and the connection between theology and spirituality. And finally, I will mention that he also is an expert in the philosophical traditions of the Byzantine period that are mostly known as Neoplatonism. So I think that's enough of an introduction for a man who needs no introduction. Let's go on now to our interview. Hello, Father Andrew. It is a delight to see you.
Hello, Sister Vassa. It's great to be with you too, or not exactly with you, but virtually with you.
Virtually with me, indeed. I think that all the viewers that are watching now, as this airs on Saturday morning, will really get a treat in hearing from you. Now, Father Andrew, I will begin right away with our questions. First of all, tell us when, how, and why did you become Orthodox?
Well, the first is quite easy. When was the 2nd of December 1989,
Okay.
which was a Saturday, when it was in Oxford. And I was received by, I think then, Bishop Callistos, I think he was not yet a metropolitan, in the church in Oxford. How? By chrismation. Why?
What was your previous communion?
I was an Anglican. I'd been an Anglican all my life. I'd been an Anglican priest. I was ordained priest just over 50 years ago as an Anglican. And I functioned, I suppose, for nearly 20 years. But for various reasons, which we don't necessarily need to go into, I stopped functioning as a priest and left Oxford University as a fellow and chaplain in 1985. And then I encountered what Anglicanism really was like, not the sort of thing you can do in the college chapel. And I found myself less and less at home in it. But that's only the negative bit. I mean, one doesn't become Orthodox, or at least one shouldn't become Orthodox because one doesn't like where one is. One's very likely to find that one doesn't like.
That's fascinating what you just said. One shouldn't become Orthodox because one doesn't like where one is. Is that correct?
Exactly. I mean, if that's the only reason, then you'll never stay because you'll find Orthodoxy just as bad anyway in different ways. But no, it was partly, it was, I suppose, look, I don't know how interesting this is, but 3 elements, I would say. One is an academic element, as it were, or an intellectual element. The kind of Anglicanism that I thought I came back to after my period of teenage doubt was what I thought of as a kind of traditional Anglicanism. I read people like Richard Hooker, Lancelot Andrews, the Caroline Divines, lots of a kind of scholarly Anglicanism. In fact, that seems to be one of the best things about Anglicanism, and is also its greatest weakness. It tends to be much too intellectual when it's at its best, and when it is at its worst, sort of doesn't know where it is at all.
Right.
And so, over the years, over the decades, I found myself embracing what I thought was traditional Anglicanism, appealing to the Greek fathers and that kind of thing, but found that not many other Anglicans saw it like that at all. So I felt not very much at home. Then in the 70s, I was in Oxford as a chaplain, one of the colleges, Anglican chaplain, and I came to know the Orthodox community there. Bishop Callistos was there. I think still Father Callistos in those days. Nicholas Zernoff was a great magical figure, really, extraordinary person who had a great impact upon me in the 70s. So I knew people, and I knew other members of the mostly Russian community in Oxford. So Orthodoxy was not just an abstract notion, it was a community of people. And then I suppose a rather crucial event was in 1984, must have been, I think, when I was sort of falling out of the Anglican Church and not really knowing where I was. I visited with a Greek Orthodox priest who had been a pupil of mine at Oxford, the monastery in Essex. And I was just going there because he wanted to be near his parish, which was in Colchester, for the weekend. And I knew about Father Sophrony. I'd read his works. I'd even, what's about the right date, I think? I'd even been given a copy of, from Father Simeon, just suddenly came in the post, of Wadia Telkile, the book that caused such a fuss when it was published in the mid-80s, Seeing God as He Is. And it was a book that was originally published in French. It was written in Russian, translated by Father Simeon, published in French. And this copy came to me, it just came to my house. It was sent to me by Father Simeon, signed. And anyway, shortly after that, I went to the monastery, not expecting to see Father Sophrony, but I did. He wanted to see me.
Father Sophrony, you met.
Father Sophrony summoned me to see him, and I saw him twice over the weekend. And it's very difficult to sort of say what exactly. I mean, I can remember lots of our conversation, bits and pieces, but it wasn't so much anything specific. It was just the encounter with this extraordinary, wonderful, holy man. And though I didn't go back to the monastery again for a long time, I felt very much that I was very much under his protection. And over the next few years, I came closer to Orthodoxy. I had a year's instruction with Bishop Kallistos. By that time, I was teaching in London, but living near Oxford. And then, so received in 89.
Right. Could I ask how old you were?
I must have been 45.
Okay, so in middle age. Thank you for sharing your story, Father, of conversion to Orthodoxy. I'll get to my second question now. You have written extensively on the connection between spirituality and theology. And I'd like to note that I think that many, even church-going Orthodox Christians, particularly in our postmodern times, that perhaps find, well, exact definitions sort of not appealing. Perhaps many of our faithful do not see the point in studying theology and do not understand the connection between theology and their everyday prayer lives, if I could define spirituality that way. They may not, for example, understand the point. I get this question sometimes, what the point is of, for example, professing the creed in the daily private prayer, or of professing the creed, say, in the context of divine liturgy. So could you share with our viewers, Father Andrew, how learning the Church's theology, and also in the way it has been expounded by the Church Fathers, or being ignorant thereof, being ignorant of the Church's theology, how it impacts our daily lives, both privately and communally as Church?
Well, the first thing I think I'd want to say is that I think certainly in the West, theology is often very badly taught. Or rather, what you're taught is not theology. You're taught, as it were, the things you need to know in order to think theologically, but the last step is never taken. I felt this very strongly when I moved from Cambridge to Edinburgh and studied with Tom Torrance for a couple of years. And though I had not much in common with Torrance, I have to say, I didn't really sort of not very sympathetic to his sort of Barthian Calvinism. At least he was a theologian, and he asked theological questions and wanted theological answers. Whereas at Cambridge, I thought that what I was doing, except with one person, most of the time what we were doing was studying things that provided you the kind of information that you would need if you asked theological questions, but never actually getting around to asking them. And I think that a lot of the students are often very bewildered as to all this stuff you learn about Old Testament and New Testament and church history and councils and so on. All of this. Well, what's this got to do with well, as you say, with one's prayer life? And the more I've thought about it, the more I think that and indeed, in my time at Oxford, I tried initially as a very young Don, an annoying person, to say that when we study the Fathers, for instance, we shouldn't simply study the Fathers as the background to the arguments that led to the decisions of the councils. These are people who are important in their own right, and we should look at other works than the works that are sort of technically dogmatic works. And there's a great deal there. I mean, most of the patristic literature is in fact sermons addressed to people, not treatises addressed to theologians. And when I tried to put it together, I wanted to say something like this: that if we're talking about theology, we're talking about God. And if we're talking about God, we are not talking about some sort of concept. But a lot of theology does. It says that God is the prime mover, the creator, the one who sets everything in motion, or God is a kind of providence that moves throughout the world and holds everything together, or that God is the sort of guarantor of our moral values, some sort of concept that we can do something with. And I would rather want to say that God is the one to whom we pray, and put the notion of prayer at the centre. And that seems to me to make very good sense of the way in which these things are presented even in the Gospels. I mean, there's a lot of stress laid on the Lord spending time in prayer, whole nights in prayer. John's Gospel, which is a kind of, seems to me to be a sort of deeper consideration of the topics, of the way the synoptics approach it. Again, instead of just having the agony in the garden, you have the whole of chapter 17, where the Lord prays to the Father at length about his relationship to him, what he's come on earth to do, prays for those who have become his disciples. Prayer seems to me to be absolutely the centre of how we are to understand God. And I would want to start from there, and rather than start from God as some sort of concept. Our relationship with him is defined in terms of prayer. And I think the same thing goes for say, for instance, the notion of the church. What holds the church together is not primarily the institution. It isn't, of course, it has an institution, and it's bound to have an institution existing on there. But what holds the church together, it seems to me, the sinews of the church, I think, are the prayer of first of all, the prayer of Christ, and then the way in which we, in our own prayer, enter into Christ's prayer to the Father. And it seems to me that this is the way in. And then questions come like, well, who is this God to whom we pray? What is the relationship of Jesus to the Father? These are questions that become important because if we get them, for instance, suppose we take the line, which I think many, many Christians now do, that Jesus was a man who was a good man, and that we should try and follow him, and he will in some way lead us to the Father. But that's actually a long, long way short of what the New Testament is about. A long way short of the presentation of Jesus either in the Gospels or in St. John's Gospel or in St. Paul, where there is a sense that there is such a deep communion between the Father and the Lord, that, as Jesus says to Philip, "You have seen me, has seen the Father." There is such a deep communion that and it's this communion into which we enter. And if we ask what that means, then we find ourselves moving towards a doctrine of the Trinity, a doctrine of the way in which we must speak of Christ in two ways. That we must speak of him as one who comes to us, but also one who comes to us as one of us. And it seems to me if you approach it like this, then its relevance to the way we pray, the way we live our lives, becomes much more direct. But what I'm not suggesting doing something different. I'm suggesting that we look at the way in which the fathers really approached this, instead of just looking at the arguments that they used with people who got it wrong.
So,
That makes sense?
as I understand, well, not entirely, because the way I understand what you have described, Father Andrew, is that it is prayer that leads us to ask questions about who God is, and not vice versa. Because I think that in postmodern day Orthodoxy, one gets the impression sometimes, but it's not official or anything, but I inhabit a world that is very much online, not all the time, but it is, church discussions and church-related discussions. Now, one gets the impression that Orthodoxy has all the answers. Now, when one has all the answers, then questioning in the first place, and I'm not talking about questioning, I'm talking about being more and more curious about God insofar as we love him. It's like being curious about your beloved and wanting to know more. And so, like when Thomas says, I will not believe unless I touch him. Well, this is not an example of any kind of betrayal or I would say of weakness of Thomas's commitment. It is an engagement. It is a will to know the Lord. But in our day, any kind of posing of questions, particularly by, I would say, leading theologians. There wasn't so long ago a whole uproar about something that the great Metropolitan Callistus wrote. I don't need to remind you of that. And so even posing questions seems to be not something that a lot of people would agree comes from prayer. And I love that you make this connection between, a prayer life actually leading to the asking of questions because it matters and because we don't have all the answers. Also, I think on a communal level, because the church continues to discern. I'm sorry that I have started this whole tirade because we do want to listen to you, but I would love for you to clarify that so that, because you began with a sort of critique of theology being, or God being sort of studied first as some kind of a concept, rather than these questions coming from prayer and a desire to know him. If you could get back to the questions, how is asking questions about God and actually saying, I am still growing in getting to know the answers. How is that congruent with or in sync with piety?
Even if it, and I believe it is the case that in Orthodoxy we have found the true faith. We sing at the end of the liturgy. That's true. We have. There is. It's a different kind. It's not the kind of search that an individual undertakes, having no idea where he's going, no idea what he's thinking, what he's about. But even if we have found the true faith, we haven't entered into it individually, each one of us, either as much as we need, or necessarily in the same kind of way. I mean, if the faith is as big as we say it is, if we're actually coming to the threshold of something which is completely beyond our understanding, and if we believe, Orthodox theology in the last century has made a great deal about being apophatic, about that we cannot exhaust our knowledge of God. It's not something that we can just simply sort of it's not a lot of information that we could put down in a big book and say that's it. There's more to it than that. If that's the case, then I think asking questions is part of the way in which we enter more deeply into the faith that we believe. Sometimes I think one can sometimes make a distinction between what the church believes, which is a result of its experience over millennia, and in some ways the councils are kind of landmarks of where we are. But each of us then have to make it our own. And making this our own is a process. I think the other thing too, thinking about the tirade against Bishop Callistos, I felt that almost everything that I read that wanted to, in attacking Metropolitan Callistos, attacked him out of fear. There was fear for all sorts of reasons. I mean, fear of some kind of landmarks being sort of removed, as if this kind of fear of what might happen next. Just if our questioning grows out of our prayer, then it will be, as you said, these will be the questionings of one who loves and wants to learn more about who it is that he loves. And we're learning more and more about who Christ is, more and more about Christ's love for us, and more about how this Christ's love for us is not, how can I put it? We've just celebrated Pentecost, and at Pentecost, we have this wonderful gospel. At the last day of the feast, Jesus stood up and said, "Anyone who thirsts, come to me and drink, and out of his belly will flow streams of living water." It's not come and drink and you'll be thirsty and you'll be satisfied. Come and drink and you yourself will become someone from whom other people can drink. Now, this element is something that seems to be so important, and it's not going to happen if we just simply see the faith as some sort of bulk of certainty that we can just simply recline on.
Right. So the study of theology would be one of the things that helps us to make that entrance.
Yeah, I mean, what theology ought to do is to give us the ability to look at all the sorts of sources that there are. There's the Bible. There's the teaching of the fathers. There's more important, perhaps even than that, though, is something like the liturgy and what the liturgy means. I mean, you know a lot about this, but the liturgy, there's a lot of hard scholarly work that goes into understanding what liturgy means. But in the end of the day, one's trying to understand what happens, what is going on when we participate in the liturgy. And that is something that is unending in its implications. And I think that trying to understand the way in which the movement of the liturgy, the gestures of the liturgy, the structure of the liturgy, and all of this is in some way Christ coming to us and drawing us to himself and drawing us into his offering to the Father. When I give catechesis, if we want to become Orthodox, I focus really on the liturgy. I say, this is something you will experience. And then you can ask questions about it, and the questions will sort of take you into other ways. And the creed's right there in the middle, and we can ask about the creed. But I wouldn't want to take the creed just as some sort of summary of the Christian faith that has no context in the Christian faith.
Isn't it interesting that we actually pray the creed?
Absolutely, yes.
Sometimes it's misunderstood as some kind of a proclamation.
Well, we start off by the deacon says, "Let us love one another, that with one mind we may confess." And then we confess it. But we confess this because this is going to help purify and deepen our love for one another and for God.
Oh, right.
Thank you. Not just a statement.
Yes, indeed. Thank you, Father Andrew. And my next question to you, Father, is something that's connected to what I mentioned to our viewers in the introductory part of this video, that in your latest book, Modern Orthodox Thinkers, you also included several female theologians, for example, the Holy Martyr, Mother Mary, or Maria Skoptsova of Paris, and Elizabeth Beer-Sigel of blessed memory. One could view this inclusion of women into the category of Orthodox thinkers, I think, as quote unquote untraditional. After all, historically, the study of theological thinking and thinkers is known as patrology. That is, that it includes only fathers and not mothers. So my question to you, Father, is do you observe perhaps a change in modern day Orthodox churches in women's vocations and ministries? And when I say vocations, I mean, is it possible to say, as Elizabeth Beer-Sigel actually says in her writings, that women are being called, that is, not by merely human voices, but being called to ministries that are untraditional for them?
It seems to me that ministry means serving one another. I mean, that's what the word is about. And it is not something that only some people do. Everybody in the church has a vocation to serve God, to serve Christ, to serve the church, to serve one's fellow Christians, to serve the world. And it's the clericalization of ministry is something that, well, there are sociological explanations as to why it occurs. Any institution tends to sort of go in that direction. And the church has done it in a rather dramatic way. So the first thing I'd want to say is that we don't start by saying we have people who are ministers and how can women enter in. We don't start off by saying, look, there are priests. We have a male ministry of the church, and how do women enter into that? That seems to be the wrong way around. The question really is to ask, why is it that given that ministry is something that service within the church is something that everybody in the church is involved in, given that's the case, why do we have a male hierarchy? It's not what you'd expect to happen, unless we're a very, very cynical historian. It's not. It has happened, but I wouldn't want to start from there and say, well, let's think of ways of involving women in a ministry which they don't exercise. I'd rather do it the other way around and say, look, all of us in the church exercise a ministry. There is the ministry of the priesthood, but that is not the only ministry, and that we need to begin to think about. We think about ways of understanding the diversity of ministry that actually already exists within the church. You mentioned Maria of Paris and Elizabeth Beer-Sigel as women in my book. There's another woman in the book. Actually, there's several other women in the book.
Yes. I named two examples, Father.
Yeah. Well, I don't know that many others, but there's another one who is Mother Thecla, who I mentioned. You may have heard of.
Yes.
I mean, she's
only from your book, I must admit.
She's known in the outside world, if she's known at all, as the person who collaborated with John Tavener, the composer. They were very close for a long time, and many of the librettos of his early Orthodox writings were written by her. But the thing about Mother Thecla was that she, for me, she was. I learnt more about what was meant by being Orthodox from her than perhaps anybody else. It just so happened that when I became Orthodox, and within a few weeks I then moved from Oxford, where there is Oxford parish, to the north of England, where there was nothing. And the nearest thing was the monastery of the Assumption at outside Whitby, where Mother Thecla was. And I got to know her quite well. But I found there was a quality of spiritual motherhood that was her gift to the church. And I think that if one looks at it from this end, there is a great deal of service within the church, ministry within the church, which is being exercised by all sorts of people other than the priestly hierarchy. And that we need to recognize that first. The second thing I would say is that is not intended as a way of short-circuiting any discussion about whether women could be part of the ministerial priesthood of the church, as it's called. I think that I'm not intending to short-circuit that discussion. I'm just thinking where I think the discussion, there's a lot that actually takes place that needs to be discussed before we get around to, or put another way around. I think one of the dangers that I've seen, though from afar, from outside in the Anglican Church, is that the Anglican Church over the last almost 30 years has ordained women and now bishops. But to a very considerable extent, what has happened is that women have been forced into a role which is still defined in largely masculine terms. They're fitted. They are being fitted into a ministry which is inevitably, for historical reasons, inevitably defined in largely masculine terms, and that seems to me to be a great pity. It seems to be an opportunity that's been lost, and I really deeply, deeply pray that whatever route the Orthodox Church takes, it takes it in a way that is genuinely radical, goes to the roots of what ministry means and builds it up from there, rather than just simply trying to adjust to society, which I think is what is really happening, and without thinking too carefully about what that really means.
Yes. Thank you, Father Andrew. Yeah, there's a lot that you give us to think about. I do want to note that I didn't ask about the female priesthood. It's really a question about tradition and how that term is sometimes misunderstood to mean unchangeable. You see, the problem I have with people indicating tradition or pointing to tradition when one talks about a change in ministries or say who does certain ministries is that one will point, well, it's never been done. It's never been done that say women were for example, it's said that because women were deaconesses or female deacons up to say the early second millennium, hence it's possible for them to do it again. See, for me, that does not follow. There's that kind of logic that at a certain point in history, it was found to be, for various reasons that you know better than I do, not to be necessary in the church. My question is it possible? That's why I phrased it this way. Is it possible that, say, a different demographic or an additional demographic would be called to a certain ministry? You see, as far as I can see, which I don't have a particular interest in female priesthood, even though because I'm a woman, you're not allowed to say you're a woman if you're a monastic, but I think it's obvious anyway. But I'm not interested in it for a personal reason. I find it canonically interesting, and I find it not satisfying the types of answers that are given. And I think it goes to the heart of what tradition is. And I'll just finish my little second tirade now. But see, when St. Paul, or the author of Hebrews talks about priesthood and how there is a new order of priesthood according to the order of Melchizedek and so forth. And when he's at pains, the author of Hebrews, to show that there is now a new and expanded priesthood, I feel that what I am told, and really I am fine with there not being female priests, but what we see is that before it was limited to the Levites, right, in the Old Testament, before the era of the church. And we see that there's this earthquake and a change in how God calls to the priesthood in the era of the church. So my simple point, it's not very simple, but that here we do have as far as who does what, I think that this is one of the changeable externals of tradition, while, historically changeable. And I like to think of it this way. You could obviously correct me if I'm in some kind of a delusion, but I feel that we often miss the fact that tradition has two pillars that are both the mystery that's unchangeable, and then the history that is the stuff that is how that unchangeable mystery is passed on, how it is revealed, how it is accomplished in this world symbolically. And then, there's the argument that people make with regard to the priesthood that it's connected to male symbolism all the time. But when you don the stiharion, you compare yourself to a bride, right? And then we have these feet washers in the Gospels that are all women. And when the Lord finally does foot washing, or feet washing, I'm sorry, I sound like I don't speak English often enough. But when the Lord washes the feet of the disciples, he's doing something that up to this moment has only been done by women. And he tells the disciples that I've shown you what Christian ministry is all about. And then people say that there's only male symbolism connected to even priesthood. But I think that there is some female symbolism. And again, I don't have an agenda to push through female priesthood, and not only because I'll be burnt at the stake if I say that, but because I'm interested in the topic and in the argumentation, so as to learn, as you told us at the beginning of the interview, because we want to know more, we want to understand better. These questions are being posed. Okay, sorry, Father, that's it. Please share your thoughts.
Look, you remember what Pelikan said? I can't remember it exactly, but I think it's something like this: that traditionalism is the dead faith of the living, and tradition is the living faith of the dead.
Right. Yes, I do remember. That's classic.
I think that's about right. But look, tradition in one sense is unchanging, yes. But the world in which we hear it, the world to which it speaks, is not unchanging. It is changing the world in which we live. And I mean, if our response to tradition is unchanging, it's likely to be wrong, because we're living in a world that is changing, and so the way what the tradition has to say to the world in which we live is going to vary, and I think that's just obvious. But I come back again to. I would rather see tradition as a kind of treasure house of the experience of the church.
Of what?
A treasure house of the experience of the church. Everything that people have experienced in their following of Christ, in their celebrating together the presence of Christ among them, all of this, and everything that people have experienced in prayer. This is it's a treasure house from which we can take, which we can learn, from which we can be inspired, where we can find somebody who resonates with us and feel. Now, this is somebody that I want to know more about, because this person's understanding of what it is to live chimes in with me, because we're all different. What I don't like is the idea of tradition as some sort of essentially understood negatively, saying no, not this, not this, not this, not this, not this, because what lies behind that, I think, is fear. And I think
again, you mentioned fear. That's
I would almost say, though you have to qualify it a bit, but I almost say that if what you do is you're doing out of love, then don't worry, it's fine. If what you're doing is done out of fear, then you need to be rather careful and think again.
And you're not talking about the fear of God. You're talking about self-centered fear, correct?
Yes. Fear of God is rather different. I mean, fear of God is not contrary to the love of God. I mean, the fear of God, the awe that we feel. I remember once reading in I can't remember what it was now. It was a French text. I can't remember what it was. A pagan philosophical text, edited by a Frenchman who wanted to say that in this context, phobos is badly translated as clout. It is law anglais, the AWE, anglais.
Okay.
That sense of awe. And that sense of awe is something that comes, it's something that really comes from the depths of love, rather than from fear, in the sense of fear of consequences, fear of being a kind of negative sense. Awe is not a negative thing; it's a very positive thing. It's a sense of wanting to hold ourselves before this and experience it more and more deeply. It's a sense that it's opposed to a kind of simple, a kind of familiarity, which is almost bordering on contempt. That's what it's against.
Right. Holding. Yeah. Taking for granted, perhaps. Yes.
Like taking for granted, as it were. There's something we can't take for granted, but fear. Well, kind of superstition is often fear as well. Fear that you haven't sort of ticked all the right boxes, so you'll tick every single one, that sort of thing. And I think I feel that change that one cannot control or cannot understand very often leads to a kind of fear.
Right.
And I think that fear of change, because we are not confident in the love of God.
Thank you for that. I think that's very helpful.
I mean, I think that is something which is we need to be we need to preach. I mean, we need to tell people that we don't need to be afraid. It doesn't mean there's nothing to do, but we don't need to be. When we look at the world around us, look at sort of the big, things like climate change and the possibility of 10, 20 years time there'll be nowhere to live because already I just read the other day that in the last 5-6 years, several Pacific islands no longer exist because of the rising temperature of the earth. These are huge things, which it's very easy to respond with this kind of fear, and sometimes a fear that says, "Well, I don't believe it. I'm not going to have to do with it. I don't want to know about it." But if we can genuinely believe what we say we believe in God's providence. We believe that we can be confident in a God who loves us and who looks after us in his providence. Then I think we'll be able to find ways of dealing not just with the problems of the church, but I think also with the problems of the world, because fear is paralyzing and love is enabling.
What is enabling?
Love.
Love, right. Thank you so much for pointing out that our types of fear that are not fear of God, but fear of the changeable, which is not of God, because God is not changeable. Right? Because if God is present in my life and I am present to him, I find that my fears that come sort of by default when he slips out of sort of my, scope, or I lose sight of him sort of, by default, I have fears, say, of economic insecurity. That's a big one for people, right? Fear of being alone. People fear that. A lot of people feel very fear of human opinions. All of this kind of thing that is changeable and unpredictably so is, I think, very natural to a faithless life. But this unchangeable presence, right, upon whom we can depend and should, is something that casts away fear. I find that, in practice. I find the hole in the heart, the void that comes from God not being, taken not into account, but well, when we slip out of communion with him, I want to say.
Yeah.
It's understandable, right? Because we can't manage even our own burdens, right? We can't, if I go into self-reliance, attempting to carry the world on my shoulders, I will inevitably find that they're not built for carrying the whole world, right? That Atlas does shrug. Anyway, Father Andrew, thank you so much for indicating, the changeability also in the church might instill fear into us. I think that C.S. Lewis somewhere writes that we very much preferred the old kind of science that was more into laws. And then when quantum physics came along, that's sort of less predictable. I don't have the exact quote, parat, but our security blanket of predictability is shaken. But God is also unpredictable, I think, right? Anyway, I'm not interested in the rest of my line of thought there. But I think we're going to wrap this up now, Father Andrew. Thank you so much for being a guest on our little show.
Thank you for inviting me. It's been great to have. Well, it's such a lively exchange, which is a great thing. I think that we don't find out things by as it were, sort of following our little lines of thought, but by engaging with other people, really, and that's what.
Yes, indeed. That's why it's always pleasant to talk with you, although I have done so only very rarely. But lovely to have you on the show. And I ask for your blessing, Father Andrew, and your prayers when you remember, okay? And all the zillions, that's a sort of funny name for the little group of people who follow this show, are also grateful to you. Goodbye now, and a happy upcoming feast of the Holy Apostles.
Thank you very much. Bye.